Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and having learned quite a few things from, through, and from within human interactions, and having pursued and completed my master's in business administration and in clinical psychology, I today wish to talk about silence and silent treatment. Now, I'm assuming that most of us would have heard the saying that silence is golden. And yes, that's true when it's mindfully taken into consideration, when it's mindfully communicated. So, like, say, for example, when we enter any library, over there the clear instructions are please try to maintain silence. Or the instructions, i.e., the communication, in that context can also be please keep your voices low. Essentially, clearly communicating that here is a place where people have come to read, to mindfully read, to gather information about something, or even as a way of relaxing and rejuvenating, as a way of pursuing their hobbies, and thereby as an intention to not disturb others around. It's a request that is communicated pretty clearly in written words. Please maintain silence or kindly keep your voices lower. Or when we are working onto something, when we are creating something, and we have already communicated to the others around that we need a little quieter space to be able to focus onto the task, onto the creative aspect that we are engaging in, because we want to mindfully engage in the work that we are doing without getting knowingly or unknowingly infiltrated by the voices and the sound around. Because even if we don't get infiltrated knowingly, our subconscious is always picking up things that are happening around us, whether we are aware of them or not. It can also be golden when we are sitting beside a beach side or in any other circumstance that we are trying to create for ourselves, so as to be able to self-reflect, so as to be able to self-analyze ourselves, our choices, our life, and our decisions, to become more self-aware, to enhance our own intrapersonal intelligence, to enhance our own emotional intelligence, to enhance our own relational, both on intrapersonal and on interpersonal levels, the relational intelligence. However, it becomes abusive. It's an abuse, an emotional abuse, a psychological abuse, when it's used as a silent treatment. Then it no longer remains golden, but it rather becomes a whipping lash that is used to punish somebody else, that is used to emotionally manipulate by emotionally abandoning somebody else, that is used as a very subtle form of control to coax somebody into doing exactly what you would like them to do, how you would like them to behave, how you would like them to be when they are interacting with you. So as much as abuse can look like shouting and screaming and hitting and slapping somebody, or being obviously violent, both in terms of our vocabulary and in terms of our physical actions, abuse can also happen in very subtle ways. Abuse can also happen by neglecting somebody deliberately, and that's termed as emotional neglect. Abuse can also look like silent treatment, wherein the person who's giving the silent treatment in very subtle ways wants a certain kind of a reaction from the other person or the other people in their relationships. Silent treatment in a very subtle way, in a very passive aggressive way, is a way of communicating to the other people to understand who the boss is in the relationship, who's in charge of the relationship, who has more power in the relationship, within the relationship dynamic. And in a very subtle way, in a very passive aggressive way, it's a very dominant factor within the relationship, in the relationship. Because in such relationship dynamics, in such interactions, there is always somebody who will be chasing this other person who goes silent. Without clarity, without communication, without any interaction. There is always somebody who'll be over explaining, who'll be over justifying, who'll be overly apologizing. And they do so primarily because, first, these people who are chasing the one who's stonewalled them, who's given them the silent treatment, are over analyzing the conversations, are over analyzing their histories, are over analyzing the things as to what could have been done better to not let this happen, for they feel emotionally abandoned. And in a way, when they start to overanalyze and over-justify and over-apologize, they very gradually, they very subtly, one stone at a time, one brick at a time, begin to lose the trust in themselves. It hampers their self-esteem. It hampers their self-confidence. And to some degree, they begin to feel that their feelings, that their thoughts, that their power of expression, their authentic power of expression is abandoned when the other person gives them the silent treatment, when the other person emotionally begins to abandon them. The silent treatment, i.e. stonewalling, wherein the person is building psychological walls to create a distance, to disconnect in the communication, within the interaction, within the relationship, is also not willing to provide a space for different kinds of experiences and different kinds of realities to exist at the same time, wherein having a different reality which is not in keeping with them, which is not in keeping with their ideas, their ideologies, and their beliefs, gets triggered. They kind of shut down. They kind of withdraw their emotional connection. They kind of emotionally abandon, which may make the other person or other people within the relationship structure either start to settle for breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs with regards to interactions, with regards to communication, with regards to connection. And people just might get used to having the crumbs in life, to having the crumbs of that relationship, within that relationship, rather than having a wholesome relationship, rather than having a fully expressed relationship. The silent treatment also tells us that the person is not willing to communicate clarity, but rather wants to create a desperate state for both people or the people within that relationship, wherein the distress of the feeling of that emotional abandonment gets so exaggerated and gets so intensified that when the person who stonewalls or when the person who gives the silent treatment most of the day returns in a desperate attempt, in an exaggerated attempt to bridge the gap, to not feel emotionally abandoned, do not address and resolve the issue, but rather push and brush it aside. Once again, unknowingly re-emphasizing for themselves that they should be happy and okay with breadcrumbs, because that's the normal, because that's what I can ask for, and that is why that is what I should settle for. And at least as of now, when this person who had given the silent treatment, had stonewalled, comes back, at least I'm getting the crumbs, if not the whole bread. कुछ नहीं से कुछ भी अच्छा है is the thinking that kind of begins to seep in and stay in, which in a very unconscious, in a very subtle way, starts eroding one's own self-trust, one's own self-worth, and one's own self-value, and thereby one's own self-confidence. The relationships in which silent treatment is given is also the place wherein clarity doesn't exist, wherein communication is not healthy, wherein conflicts are not resolved but rather brushed aside, pushed aside, dumped in the dumpster, where accountability for communicating one's own feelings is not accounted for. It's also the place wherein other people's feelings, thoughts, emotions are completely discounted. It's an unhealthy relationship dynamic of the cat and the mouse chase. And maybe, if we reflect, these are also the relationships wherein expectations are just limited to the crumbs of the whole bread. For expectations, needs, and wants are never authentically, genuinely, and completely communicated, wherein boundaries are also not clearly communicated, but rather boundaries, emotional boundaries, psychological boundaries, are invalidated, are neglected, are not listened to, are not paid attention to almost all the time. For relationships which are interpersonal, shared between two and many people, will always have many points of view that might differ on some level or the other, will have interactions wherein different belief systems might come up, wherein different value systems might come up, wherein there will be conflicts at some point in time or the other. And yet, within the healthy relationships, where people don't lash out onto one another verbally or physically, and where people don't give and take the silent treatment, is where essentially the two people or many people within that relationship, within certain contexts, when in a tough situation, when in a tight spot, are actually able to communicate, are actually able to tell the other person or other people that I need a little time off, a few hours to a couple of days, to reflect on what has happened because that has triggered some unpleasant things within me. And I want to be very mindful when I interact with you again. I would not want to utter words at this point in time which I cannot take back, but will have a long lasting, probably a hurtful impact on you. But you can feel assured, and I promise you that I'm not leaving you, that I'm not abandoning you, but I'm willing to mindfully communicate in order to resolve it, in order to understand you better, and in order to understand myself better. For as much as I would want my experience, my feelings, my thoughts to be right and to be validated, I would also like your point of view as a teammate, your feelings, your thoughts to have equal grounding and footing within this relationship. For emotionally and metaphorically, I'd like to have a wholesome relationship rather than the breadcrumbs crumbling relationship. And many a times it's equally important to understand that the person who does the stonewalling, that the person who shuts down, that the person who gives the silent treatment might not always be doing it intentionally, though that is also a possibility. But slash and it can also be a learned behavior that they picked up while they were growing up. For it was what they observed was done to them, was done onto them when they were kids, and they unknowingly and unintentionally observed and just absorbed, and it became a part of their behavioral mechanics, automatically being played out. It can also be laced with the cultural understanding that men or boys kind of shut down, kind of disconnect themselves, kind of stonewall the other people when they feel overwhelmed, when they feel like a child who actually cannot do much, withdraw from the conversations and the connections, for they feel overwhelmed because right from the very beginning, right from their childhood, they've been curated and cultivated with the message, knowingly or unknowingly, through their own parents, through their own grown-ups, with the people around them, through the movies, that men don't communicate that much, that men remain silent, that don't be such a girl, that don't be like your sister, that just shut up and behave like a man. And in a way, unknowingly, that also trains them, that also cultures them to be not fully expressed, to be not fully revealed, to be not fully connected. And if knowingly or unknowingly, deliberately or unintentionally, we have been playing and repeating the silent treatment within our relationships, intentionally or unintentionally, we need to become aware that we are not having a wholesome, a wholehearted relationship experience. that we are not having the experience of the team that has each member's back, invariably lacking trust, invariably allowing no space for vulnerability and openness, and invariably working on the punishment model. And wherever people knowingly or unknowingly get punished, they begin to fear the other, they begin to fear their own decisions, they begin to fear the relationship itself, feeling unsafe and unworthy, feeling worthy of only receiving breadcrumbs. And if we need to experience a more wholesome relationship and not the crumbs of the bread or the bread crumbing relationship, the bread crumbling relationship, we need to be able to communicate more effectively. Because at the end of everything, our deepest psychological need is of to be seen, of to be listened to, and of to be understood. And unless we learn the art of communication, of effective communication, of connected communication, we'll always be settling down just for the emotional crumbs, which will never make us feel whole and wholesome, both on a personal level and on the interpersonal levels as well. So let's try and actually see how much of our relationship is wholesome and how much of it is just crumbles and crumbling on the metaphorical level, on the emotional, on the physical, on the psychological levels. Let's try and become aware of that first before we even begin the art of learning how to communicate beautifully. And even when I say that, and even as I said that, I'm getting mindfully and painfully aware that maybe our issue is not with regards to not communicating effectively. Maybe it's not a communication problem at all. And maybe it just runs a lot more deeper than that we ourselves are not aware of, that we ourselves are oblivious to. So let me share a few examples over here. So one of my clients who's in the field of marketing and sales, in their counseling session had shared with me, which is where communication is happening, that they are not good in communicating, that their own people seem to misunderstand them. And just let me mindfully add here that I'm deliberately not revealing their pronounced identity, their identified gender. So this person, he, she, they, kind of communicates to me, kind of tells me that despite being in the field of marketing and sales, they are not able to communicate effectively. Now, having done a few sessions with them, I asked them that have they done relatively well in their professional field? And again, as no surprise and as no shock to me, they told me that they've been able to do pretty well in their professional life. And I asked them to reflect on that despite being in the field of marketing and sales and having done professionally well for themselves, in the field that requires one to communicate effectively and efficiently and impactfully, what makes them think that they're not good in communicating effectively, efficiently, and impactfully? And so they went on to tell me that it's not the same professionally and personally, that it's a whole different ballgame altogether. So once again, in a very curious way, I asked them to reflect upon if they've never ever had to deal with a difficult boss, a difficult colleague, a very demanding colleague, rather even a client, a boss or a colleague that's even unyielding. And they told me that yes, at times, not most times, they have dealt with such bosses, such clients, and such colleagues. And yet they were able to overcome those challenges, meet those demands, because there were certain perks, privileges, and incentives that they got in return when they overcame those difficult situations, when they overcame those difficulties. And thereby, using their own language, I then asked them, so what are the incentives, the perks, and the privileges that they would like in their personal life that they haven't yet been able to communicate? Maybe they've not even recognized it for themselves. Maybe they've not written it out, spelt it out in details in specific ways. And exactly like the way they specified those things in details in their professional arena, wherein they could even specify the incentives, the perks, and the privileges that they would receive. Exactly in the similar manner, they need to specify in details the incentives, the perks, and the privileges that they wish to receive in their personal life as well. But they need to address it on the personal level first. And so maybe the real problem was not the communication skills, was not the communication problem or the art of communicating effectively, efficiently, and impactfully. But maybe the real issue is about intimacy, is about openness, is about honesty with one's own self first. And when I use the word intimacy, if you actually look into it, if you actually break it down, it sounds more like into me see. Into me I see, and into me I'd like even you to see. And thereby, it's not the communication problem, it's not the communication skills problem. It's rather a much deeper psychological issue that needs to be addressed, that needs to be seen, that then needs to be resolved. The second example is of somebody coming from a very different profession, wherein the art of communicating is an absolute, essential requisite. So here was a teacher who once shared with me that he finds it difficult to communicate. Now, a teacher who's been in the profession of imparting knowledge and information, of communicating knowledge and information, tells me that they have difficulty communicating. Well, in my understanding, the obvious question to then ask is, and to put before them as a mode to reflect, would go something like this. How have I managed to impart, to communicate knowledge and information, to interact, when communication in itself has been a huge block for me? And once again, very likely the issues are much deeper than just the skills of communication. Now, see how weird it would come across when a writer says that I find it difficult to communicate, when their entire life or their working life, their professional life has just all been about articulating and interacting effectively. Even when they are not physically present, they are still doing it through their words. They are still doing it through their thoughts that they share. And as weird and as surprising and as shocking that might come across to be, it once again tells us that it's not a communication skill problem. It's not a communication problem for somebody who's able to articulate their words and their thoughts well, or at least decently well. A boss, a colleague, a housewife, a friend, a leader who sometimes or many times delegates tasks to others definitely does not lack in the skills or the arena of communication, which is why then it becomes a necessity to look into the deeper aspect, to be able to address it at the ground root level. Now let's take a slightly different route and let's think about it a little differently, from a different reality, from a different lens, from a different perspective, that even people who are differently abled, that even people who are impaired with regards to hearing and with regards to speaking have still been able to communicate, have still been able to interact, then it truly cannot be a communication problem. Even the people who are differently abled, who are impaired with regards to hearing and with regards to speaking, have been able to invent braille and sign language to be able to communicate not just within the people who are like them, but even to the people who are differently abled than them, i.e., essentially people like us who can speak and hear clearly. And thereby, quite naturally, it's not the communication issue. So let's start imploring the real issues rather than brushing them aside with the surface level stuff of communication issues, of not having communication skills, of not having the ability to communicate well. And the real issue might just be the intimacy issue, into me see issue, into me I see issue, wherein I'm not able to intimately see within myself, into me you see issue, which then becomes a relational issue, wherein we have closed ourselves so tightly that we don't allow others to see within us, which is an indicative of a lack of trust as well, both on the personal and within the interpersonal levels. It's a safety issue as well. It's the issue of lacking emotional intelligence or not having developed emotional intelligence enough. It's the issue of lack of feeling connected. Or let me phrase it a little differently. It's essentially arising from the feeling of feeling disconnected, both on intrapersonal, personal level, as well as within the interpersonal connections, within the interpersonal bonds, within the interpersonal relationship. Invariably, once again, filtering down to the relationship issue, both with one's own self and with others. Others, primarily, whom we call our own, whom we claim to love and care for. So when we talk of abuse, whether through verbally and physically abusing somebody, whether it's being directly and overtly aggressive with somebody, which includes ourselves as well, or whether it's giving and receiving the silent treatment, essentially entailing psychological emotional abandonment, and whether we are doing it knowingly or unknowingly, intentionally or unintentionally, when it's happening at the subconscious, at the unconscious level, we are still creating a toxic and an abusive environment, not just for others, but even for ourselves, for everybody involved within that environment. And unfortunately, this kind of an environment, if it gets created repeatedly, if it's recycled repeatedly, knowingly or unknowingly, causes a lot of distress over a period of time and fosters the feeling of mistrust and of unsafety. And maybe when the silent treatment is not deliberately being intended upon, is not deliberately being done, which in itself is a very passive-aggressive way of abusing somebody, but is rather happening at an unconscious level, we also need to question if we have normalized, if we have gotten used to giving and receiving the breadcrumbs, the emotional crumbs, the emotional crumblings, the psychological crumbs, the psychological crumblings within our own connections. Have we over time in a habituated way reinforced within our own subconscious that this is what I'm worthy of receiving and giving, that this is what I'm worthy of sharing, that something at least is better than nothing at all? And have we been emotionally depriving and starving ourselves and others as well? Have we been emotionally and psychologically malnourished and probably just have gotten used to it? And we always have a choice to remain used to it, or we have a choice to ask for the incentives, for the perks with regards to our connections that we think that we deserve to receive. Not are entitled to receive, but rather we deserve to receive and even share. So when this abusive form of treatment, i.e. the silent treatment, which looks seemingly mature, the emphasized word being seemingly, gets created within our dynamics, gets replayed within our dynamics, when it gets acted out unintentionally, automatically, I think we need to reflect, I think we need to question and get a little curious about the answers. What is this behavior when it gets enacted out? Preventing me from addressing, preventing me from confronting, preventing me from resolving. And of course, this question can't be a one-time thing, but rather will need to be reflected upon time and time and time again. And once we start to get some answers, to get our real answers that are true for us, we also need to have another question into perspective, wherein we can ask, what is this behavior keeping me safe from? What is this behavior, i.e., the silent treatment, prevented me from truly experiencing? Because in my understanding, behind every action, behind every thought, behind every belief, behind every interaction, behind every transaction, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or subconsciously, we'll always find things, we'll always come across things that has helped us feel safe, that we think have kept us safe, and yet unknowingly have become our limiting, our constricting, our restricting beliefs. And so let me once again say that if the silent treatment is done intentionally, is played out deliberately, is done with the intention of causing harm, of causing psychological harm, of causing psychological unsafety. The stonewalling, the silent treatment, is done with the intention of controlling somebody else's subjective reality, of stonewalling, of keeping out their subjective reality, is done with the intention of deliberately creating psychological distress. And if we have been receiving that, and if we have been giving that, we need to look into ourselves, to question, to ask, to directly get honest with ourselves as to what this kind of power abuse and power misuse makes me feel. And for those who've been receiving it, we need to ask ourselves as to why am I emotionally abandoning myself to receive such kind of a treatment so that the others don't emotionally and psychologically abandon me completely. As to what kinds of benefits these crumbs of bread, the crumbling pieces of the crumbs of bread, both on the emotional and the psychological level, are providing me, that I don't ask for a whole piece of bread. The whole and the wholesome bread being the symbolic representation of the whole and wholesome connection on the emotional and the psychological level. And then to even go a little deeper onto the belief systems, to be able to ask, why do I think that I'm only worthy of receiving these crumbling pieces of breadcrumbs? Because without any kind of a benefit, without it providing any kind of an advantageous service of psychologically keeping me safe, it would essentially not be there in the first place. It would have no place to fit it within ourselves, within our own psyche. For unless we ask these deeper questions and we wish to really know the answers to these questions for ourselves, we will keep repeating what we don't repair. And we can't repair if we don't address, if we don't acknowledge. And like it said, that uncommunicated expectations builds buildings and blocks of resentment, both on the personal and within the relational equation. And we always have a choice on holding on to those resentments and building those resentments. And we also have the choice of acknowledging, of addressing, and resolving those very same issues. And as I come to the closure of this particular video, and as we realize that the issue is not about not having communication skills and not being able to effectively, efficiently, and impactfully communicate. For even a one-day baby knows how to communicate by crying, by asking for what it needs. Even the ones that are impaired by their speech and by hearing are able to communicate. The issue is then not clearly about not having communication skills, but rather the issues lie much deeper than that, which we've not been able to communicate because we have not addressed and acknowledged them. And it's becoming aware of those issues. It's about acknowledging those issues. It's about addressing, i.e., communicating those issues, firstly on a very personal level, to then being able to communicate it, to share it, so that we learn to open ourselves a little better, so that we learn to trust ourselves and others a little better, so that we learn to connect better. So let's actually start looking at the deeper issues rather than brushing it aside with superficial inabilities that we actually do not have. For in my personal understanding, there is nobody who doesn't have the skills to communicate. So let's stop using that as a bandage to not address our real deeper issues, our real deeper fears, our real deeper wounds. The wounds that happened on the emotional, on the psychological level. Let's actually address them so that we move forward repairing them and not constantly repeating them, knowingly or unknowingly. Let's reflect on those questions. Let's start to acknowledge and address our own wounds. Because without acknowledging them, without addressing them, healing doesn't happen, repair doesn't happen. So let's see if we choose repeat or repair. Let's try and do that for ourselves, and I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of these videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.